This week our topic is on needs assessment, theoretical considerations. And those of you who are perhaps doing an evaluation project for your thesis or your dissertation, these theoretical considerations are really important. And in fact, as you put your plan into place, even if you're not writing a big theoretical construct and reviewing the literature like you would in a thesis or dissertation, you should have some idea about how you think your plan is going to work, how it's going to bring about change, how it's going to address your problem, and that the outcomes that you've identified as the things related to the problem will be solved. And so take just a minute here to highlight some of the things in this week's reading. At best, needs assessments assist a planner in estimating what the need is at the moment and what it may be at some time in the future if attitudes, expectations, conditions, and values do not change dramatically. Now you remember in the last chapter they talked about business as usual. So if you are looking at your plans and they're evolving and maybe your original plan has solved the problem, there's really no need to be doing that same thing or adding more to that particular program when now some other need has emerged. And so sometimes, especially stakeholders that get very involved in the way that that problem was being solved, now you say, well, that's really not the most pressing issue at the time. Now we have a new expectation or a new condition. And if values don't change dramatically, it's a little bit easier to move around. But if a community's values or the target population's values change in quite a bit, then it really is time to redo or take a look at the needs assessment and reevaluate your plans. Two other things that are brought about in your text, the concept of what is a need, and I think most of us who at least have had children where I need this, have probably explained the difference between a need and a want to them, and I think that this should make a lot of sense to you. Also this phenomenon of elasticity. But let's take a look at the concept of need first. They talk about Poinçon, who is really, they talk about him as being the person who framed the medical care system in England and the UK. But essentially, Maslow is one I'm a little bit more familiar with. In 1954, Poinçon comes along later in the 60s. But he's now just kind of drilling into this part about what Maslow had in the hierarchy of needs, and some of you may have seen this as a triangle. Meeting our basic needs first. It means our needs for survival, our food, our clothing, our shelter, our health needs. All of these come before we can start to really work on or address these needs and reach self-actualization. I think a lot of you are probably very familiar with Maslow. But when you take a look at Poinçon's his hierarchy, it's the minimum standard that's defined in this lower piece right here. It's the minimum of what we would consider almost like they discuss the poverty level, or what is really required in terms of food, clothing, shelter, and medical care. So they're obviously related. I feel like this is a definition of this need here. And if you have those types of community needs that your mission of your organization is to address, then you can start right here. But if you have the luxury of addressing a need that belongs here or here because the audience that you're working with has these other needs met, then by all means you have this need area that you can fill. And that's sometimes, especially in extension work, kind of where we're like juggling where it is that we should be in terms of needs. And the types of audiences that we should be working within our communities. And we're taking a look at that as historically. But now as we see some values have changed, some communities have changed, we have to reassess where we belong here. And that means looking at your mission or goals that you have for your organization, whether it be within extension or whether it be in some other type of organization providing some sort of service to humans, human services. So the phenomena of elasticity, I think this is some really interesting part in your text. Planners then must begin with the assumption that need is elastic. That is, it is likely to change over time, and that its elasticity extends also to demand. And so this is the thing. If you are running a program that hasn't gone through some major assessment work to see if it's still hitting its target population, if it's still addressing its outcomes, it's really time to take a look and do this needs assessment. And those changes may occur based on standard of living, the socio-political environment, the availability of resources and technologies, and the overall just growth and diversity that you might have inside of a community. A couple of other things discussed in this week's readings. So the types of need and some of the perspectives. So let's take a look at the different types of need. In fact, most of this week's reading within the chapter is talking about this and providing you some examples. Normative, perceived, expressed, and relative. Of course, you want to take a look at all of those in a needs assessment, and they do a good job defining those, and this will be part of your quiz, obviously. But I wanted to talk just a little bit. I think normative needs was pretty easy. You have some definite facts and numbers. There's some community facts and numbers. It might be you have certain numbers of unemployment. You have people, maybe it's homeless percentage, or maybe it's kids with free and reduced lunch, or maybe it's kids who have parents working under a certain age and are left home alone because they can't afford childcare. Whatever it might be, you have oftentimes facts, and if you don't have them, you can get them, and that's a normative need. These are the numbers, and this is where we expect our community to be or participating at this particular level, whether it be poverty or a certain number of having services related to children or other marginalized populations. And I'm actually thinking about elderly. I think in your chapter it talked a little bit about providing meals to the elderly and other kind of home care kinds of things. And one thing you should keep in mind as we start to look at our population, I think in 2014 was kind of the last year of the very largest population going up to that 9 billion on Earth. Regardless of how that all pans out in the future, we have a growing elderly population, and that is probably an area of need, especially for some of you in your communities, to address, and how you can help meet the needs of that particular population. Then there's this perceived need of what we think, and what I want to talk about here is, and this is what I want to spend more time on, is that we invite people in our community to tell us what they think the needs are. But we're always got to keep in mind that we are going through that filter of that individual and their experience and what population or socioeconomic group they fall into. And so if you don't invite a diversity of voices into a listening session, if you will, or a focus group for a perceived need, you might miss something. So your normative need can give you kind of a demographic snapshot of what's going on related to the actual numbers in our community. But that should then help you to filter in, especially if you're looking at focus groups, to help you with what the perceived need is. And so going to that target population, remember, think about the filter of what that, or that lens of what that individual is providing you, and try and have as many voices as you can when you, especially as you're looking at the actual demographics of your community. The express need, that's the number of people in the community who are waiting list to receive family housing, and they have to believe that if a service comes along, that they will be, they're part of that group, that can be part of it. And sometimes we might create programs or plans where they feel excluded, that it's not really inclusive to them. And so it talks a little bit about express need. And then relative need, the percentage of people placed in shelters in Community X compared to the percentage in Community Y. That means that you are kind of trying to level the playing ground, if you will, the services from community to community. And that relates, again, it's relative. It relates again to the actual needs of that community, normative related to that community in terms of numbers. For example, if you have you may have a very high crime rate in one community and a very low one in another. Of course, there's going to be more services provided to that particular group for that need. But that may be something when we look at elderly populations, that it's something that's a need, but we have to consider it in a relative way based on our size and our demographics and so forth. So types of need, it's really important to consider, and you really should consider all of them when you're going through the needs assessment. Remember that the perspective on those needs, and I did pull up my beach ball for this, and some of you have seen it, but this is, if we are looking at an issue like let's see, kids who are coming home and don't have someone there, or let's say we're looking at nutrition and we invite just a certain group of individuals, or we're looking at theft in our community. That's the issue we're looking at with this ball. And I might come with one perspective, which your text outlines, you know, for a women's shelter from perspective 1, that we need more law enforcement. Perspective, if you can see it over there, number 4, that might be a totally different perspective on the same issue. And so you put that issue ball, but you're all looking at the same issue, but you got to make sure that you have enough voices that are representative of the population, or can represent maybe the voices of that population in that group for a focus group or any type of interview, to make sure that you get it through the right lens. Program mission and goals. This is something you need to consider as well, and they don't talk about this in your text. So you need to see all the need categories that we just discussed in that planning process, if possible. Some maybe more, some less. Maybe the need one is more, if I can slide back over here, maybe the normative need, the perceived need, and the expressed need are a little bit higher than the relative need, or sometimes the bottom two, relative and expressed, may be important. But definitely the normative and the perceived need are very important as you go through, and hopefully you can grab all four of those types of need categories. But then you've got to frame those within what is your mission? What is the mission of your organization? So even though you see a need in a community, that may not be your mission. That may be somebody else's mission for them to take care of. So you have to revisit that. And that brings back something we talked about, I believe, in chapter 1, where we talk about the different type of planning, and that would be strategic planning. You're looking at what your mission and goals are related to your organization, and maybe those need to be revisited. Maybe they should have changed long ago, and we've been just doing business as usual, and it's time to look at that even before you can do needs assessment. That being said, you are looking at your mission. You don't want what I refer to as mission creep. Others have referred to it. It's not my term, but really you're creeping out there beyond what it is that you are being paid to do. You should assess more than one type of need and consider the at-risk and marginalized population. If your organization is tasked with looking at that population and you design a program that you feel is a need only to one sector, and that's very exclusionary. And oftentimes, human services, we are looking more at the marginalized populations because the group that is not marginalized has probably solved that problem already for themselves. And I think we tend to forget that sometimes our programs may be elitist and exclusionary. So at some point, you and your stakeholders and funders will evaluate the greatest need. Hopefully you have everybody involved. Oops. And then you will be addressing that business as usual model and hopefully making some adjustments there. All right. Down here then about the final analysis, we're getting to the theoretical part, the theoretical construct. How is this thing going to work together? Make sure you're analyzing the perspectives with data. So if you have this is what we think, this is our perspective on this, make sure that they have, or those individuals have, some good data, and if you don't feel comfortable with it, you go look it up. You know, if they're putting something out there, this is a big problem, really? Where is that? How do I know that this is a big problem? Where have you seen? Is this just anecdotal, or is there actual kind of data that can support your, with some evidence, your opinion? Determine if this is what is needed. That data will drive that, and determine who will be served. Going back to the populations where the need is the greatest. Determining what and who is in the need. So make sure you get help. You have stakeholders, and that means your target population and your secondary population should be involved. One caveat here, in this course we are not going to be working directly with the target population or any sample thereof, because that would require that we did an IRB, and that is because that is the group that could be harmed by whatever intervention that we have, or there's some certain risks that we put them at with whatever our intervention is. And the reason we're not going to do that is because to get an IRB we have to have this proposal, which you're doing at the end of the semester, and then we have to have minimum of about a month before we can get approval to move on. So those of you who are going to take the advanced course in evaluation and theory of evaluation, then we would be working with target populations. But for this activity, you will only be working for your needs assessment with the secondary populations and stakeholders. Better example might be if my target population are youth and I'm interested in doing after school programs, you're not going to have the ability to bring the actual youth into your focus groups or your interviews or your surveying techniques that you're going to use in your needs assessment. Rather, you're going to use parents, other community members, teachers, and that kind of thing, maybe administrators involved in schooling and so forth. So everybody who has kind of a stake in the game related to youth besides the actual target population. You can also work with advisory committees or boards on some of these things, but remember, if you're working on a particular problem or assessing a particular need, if that advisory committee is not representing that population of secondary population that has good knowledge of the target population, and they are filtering things through their perspective or lens that may not be the lens or perspective of the groups that you're targeting, then consider forming a separate committee, which is what I ask you to do in your needs assessment. Another group that you can look to or that you can do is some self-directed learning and look up the research by using Google Scholar to see what actual research is telling us about that particular need or topic. And then finally, theoretical constructs or frameworks. Those of you, again, working within a master's program and writing a thesis or dissertation, if you're in a PhD program, when you're looking at a theoretical construct for how we think things should change based on a needs assessment and a planned program, that theoretical construct or frame would be theory of change. And theory of change is related to logic models, but they're not the same. And so I provided for you a reading of some slides by somebody from the Association of Evaluation on theory of change and logic models. In fact, that's theoryofchange.org that has it on their website. But basically, the logic model is a visual representation, but the theory of change will explain what you think is happening related to the outcomes. Sometimes you may use this type of theory, theory of planned behavior. If you're depending on what your intervention might be, you would then measure people after they'd gone through a particular training, what their planned behavior might be if in fact you can't actually observe their behavior afterward. And oftentimes that's what we do because there's limitations for money and we can only look at maybe short-term outcomes versus long-term. And long-term is really where it's at, so that's why you want to it's better to have some really solid programs doing what you really think they're doing than being smattered all over the world and being really stretched too thin in some of those things. And again, a reason to look at business as usual, where we oftentimes just do more and more and more and add more and more programs instead of scaling back and focusing on what's important for the mission of our organization. And then another one that I've seen used with theoretical constructs for needs assessments and evaluation related to the theory of change are these concerns-based adoption models where you put an intervention in place and then you're also measuring why wouldn't a participant, what are their concerns based for adopting and having a change. And I've seen one or two of these put together in a research study. But for those of you doing the MS and the PhD program, these are some theoretical frameworks for you to take a look at related to needs assessment and program evaluation. All right. So a needs assessment requires looking at the big picture involving a lot of people who are really part of the community who can help you focus in on this problem. And quite honestly, you're only looking at the tip of the iceberg, if you will, right here. Oftentimes there's so much more going on and so many different factors here that you're trying to bring into play. And that should all come out as you have your focus groups, your surveys, and you begin that gathering of research data. All right, so that's my overview for the needs assessment and theoretical considerations for this week. Feel free to do any self-directed learning on those theoretical constructs that I mentioned, but hopefully this helps you as you begin to think about how do I think this is really going to work and begin to frame the questions that you're going to have for your interviews and your focus groups or even on your survey.